Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Swithun Dobson. This was in part inspired by last week's episode of the Roundtable, where we discussed chatbot GPT and AI technology and how technology affects society. Now, that was sort of a tangential, not core to the Roundtable discussion, but Swithin and I thought it would be useful to explore some of the other implications. So, I think this is where the debate is going to revolve. So I'll just spell it out here, and then we can work out from there. When this is a position that I used to hold as well, most people will say, "Well, technology is just a tool," and the implication being that technology is just a tool is that it's sort of inert or neutral in the sense that it doesn't have some sort of positive or negative pull or force or aspect to it. So the way that I want to classify the use of tools comes from Ivan Illich's River North of the Future. He talks about from all of recorded history up until the 12th century, he has what he calls the age of organon, where tools are seen as extensions of the user. So the telos, or the orientation of the use of the tool, is indistinguishable from the user of the tool, which is itself in part determined by cultural norms. Most people, we're so far removed from this idea that most people have a hard time understanding it. But in popular culture, probably the best example would be anything to do with like a samurai film, whether it's anime or live action, where they would say that the sword is an extension of the warrior, the sword is a part of the warrior, they're part of a unified whole. And the idea that a peasant would pick up a samurai sword and start fighting is just not a part of the internal nature of any of these samurai films. That's correct enough as far as it goes. Number two is the age of distality from around the 12th century to the 1980s, where you have distance between the user and the tool. So now the tool itself is defined as the telos. So swords are things that cut. Anybody can use a sword to cut things. It's now independent from sort of the medieval conception of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. And so now a good example would be like Rey from episode 7. No formal training, lightsabers cut things. He just picks it up and fights Kylo Ren, who's been training most of his life to fight. And then thirdly is what he calls the age of systems, which he ties with computers. And he argues that what has happened is that through computer digital technology, it's created a world of which man is but a subcomponent or part of. This is also discussed briefly in the 1946 preface to Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where he quotes Christ's parable, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He argues that's how we should relate to things, but in our age, that's not how we relate to it. So when I say technology, that's what I'm referring to, what Illich calls this age of systems. Now, Ellul has his own, as well as Ellul's maximum efficiency, where you seek to acquire efficiency at all costs in all forms of use of tools. So, for example, in medieval times or in ancient times, efficiency as an end in itself for things like production was not the goal. Whereas in modern industrial society, it is. So it's a combination of those two, and that's where the heart of the difference is going to be. So, floor is yours, Swim.
Okay, so with respect to the differences, apparent differences between distal, organon, and systems, would you say on your categorization, is that something that's relevant in the world, or is that kind of like a mind-dependent categorization? The reason I'm asked that is it would seem to be the case that looking at it, that the samurai sword is separate. It is not a part of the samurai. It may have been taken to be a part of who a samurai was, but clearly in a sort of a mind-independent thing, they're both separate substances, and so not part of the samurai. And so it is separate. And so you could argue maybe that the distal relation is, as it were, the true relation, insofar as it is distinct as separate objects. So then the question arises, if that's kind of if I am correct that the organon is kind of a mind-dependent reality, is that also true of a system, or is a system supposed to be somewhere in the world? Because the reason why you would need to distinguish these is because otherwise you're kind of using different criteria to determine what each of these things are, even though they're supposed to be a species of each other.
Right. So in the one hand, one could argue that, okay, this is a sort of socially constructed identity whereby something that isn't actually physically a part of your body is assumed for various social cultural reasons to be so. And then when you get to the age of distality, then the idea as well, for various reasons, we assume that it's not so. And then the system. So what makes the age of systems different than the age of organon is, rather than the human being the primary component, the human who's then using the tool, it's now the tool using the human, i.e., this broader digital computerized system. In one sense, you could argue that it is not a physical organ within the human, but we have examples throughout history of where two things that are not actually physically the same thing can be, for practical purposes, treated as so. The most obvious example would be the Christian conception of marriage. A husband and a wife are actually ontologically two separate beings, but for the sake of Christian religion, within marriage, they're considered to be one flesh. They're considered to be one thing. The concept of organon is analogous to that, in that they become one new thing.
Okay, I maybe you could do that. Although I would say that when it comes to marriage, I mean, there's a much stronger claim for sort of social ontology rather than in the case of organon, in that the family, in a sense, is prior to the individual, because in the absence of the family have been merely defined as mother, father, and progeny. The individual simply cannot exist. So I think there's a much stronger claim for that. But okay, let's suppose we go that way, and then there's a system. I mean, what I think is interesting, though, with your use of the term system, and that's where we are now, is that we agreed on in the last roundtable that essentially strong AI doesn't exist. So how is it a situation whereby we have literally a system running us, when all that are running us really ultimately is people using basically capital equipment to achieve particular goals, which to me wouldn't seem to be significantly different in any way, shape, or form from using a plow?
Well, let's look at what libertarians and anarchists have often said with regard to something else, i.e., the state, right? What is the state? Well, it's an apparatus, an organization, maybe even a social construct, which is run by people. But once enough people believe that it is a thing, and it has infrastructure built up, it has courts, it has police stations, it has military barracks, two things are the case. One, in order to preserve the state itself, there are certain costs imposed on those that rule the state, because they have to then make decisions consistent with the standard of protecting and growing the state. And they also have to impose those on other people, whether they would like to or not. Now, that's, of course, the objection that the anarchists and the libertarians have. They object to that being imposed on them, hence they resist it. But I think the idea, now again, the state isn't this thing that exists without humans and may have its own will and makes decisions. But libertarians and anarchists fundamentally agree that once it reaches a critical mass, it imposes all sorts of costs on us. And I would argue in an analogous fashion, the system produces all sorts of externality costs. So, for example, if you have a hammer and you want to use it to, say, build a shed, and you drive nails into wood to build the shed, you can then put the hammer away in a drawer, and it has no further effect on you. The global telecommunication system, even if you turn it off and you don't have a radio, a television, or a computer, still has an external effect on you. One is there's all sorts of waves, whether they're radio waves or other forms of communication waves that are in the air. You also have, the idea of noise pollution. Maybe you don't have anything going on, but somebody else does. That's also was a a big thought experiment argument for early libertarians like Rothbard. What do you do with noise pollution? Who's actually transgressing someone else? But it was a consideration that they considered necessary to resolve. And then second of all, you have people that even if you don't use it, they use it, and then they have an imposed cost on you because they're influenced by this telecommunication system. Furthermore, the telecommunication system itself is always active, so there's an energy cost, which affects the cost of energy overall for us to consume. Furthermore, there's the legal and regulatory cost of the system is set up to preserve it at the expense, if need be, of individuals. So at the end of the day, if there's a conflict between your interests and global telecommunications is going to win. Or to use another example, with the government using eminent domain, and this is a common libertarian critique, if large corporations want certain, let's say they're building a technological grid and they need land to do so, and they need your land to do so. Well, you may not want it, you may not be using it, but the government might just seize it anyhow and give it to them. So there's costs that global telecommunications imposes on you that a hammer doesn't.
I think you underestimate how much a society will always gravitate around any form of technology and create a social and economic structure, which will impose some cost. Now, they may not be to the same degree, and I suppose that's where we may differ is whether or to what extent the differences in degree end up being differences in kind. But imagine a situation in which you have a seafaring society, but for whatever reason, maybe you get sick on the sea and don't want to do that, and you actually rather go on horseback. But since everybody is directed towards producing seafaring things for boats or whatever, but supposing that no blacksmith has ever come up with a decent horseshoe, so the horse can't travel very far. Well, that clearly imposes costs on you because what you would like to do and travel by horseback is being restrained. So there is, in fact, an externality in that way. I mean, you can divide up externalities exist everywhere and always. The question is which ones are morally relevant or not. So it's not I don't like talking for libertarians as such, because every libertarian will claim every other libertarian isn't a libertarian, etc. So I'll talk for me. That my objection to the imposed cost isn't that there is an imposed cost, it's a morally relevant imposed cost, as opposed to just merely an imposed cost. So whilst it might be true that the current technological system has more direct impact, that I don't see this as a difference in kind from any other historic pre-industrial social or economic structure.
Okay, so what needs to be thought of here is that technique, as Alul calls it, as this global interlocking system of efficiency seeking to consolidate itself. What it represents and the kinds of costs that it imposes are more analogous to the state and the anarchist libertarian objections to the state, or what you would call, again, depending on if you're a left libertarian or a right libertarian, capitalism, crony capitalism, or whatever. It's more akin to those things than to not. And so if you have like a small scale production of plows and hammers in some sort of medieval hamlet, yeah, there are certain costs imposed. Just like if you have local government at the village level. But no anarchist would say, oh, well, the local government at the village level is anything analogous like the modern state. It's not. And almost all libertarian literature points to that and says that whatever the benefits or costs of that were, it is fundamentally better than the state because it's a different kind of set of costs. And the main difference is something that Ted Kaczynski points out. At that level, whether it's the local government or the blacksmith and the set of tools, these are people that you relate to on a more horizontal level. So you can actually talk to them as individuals or as groups of individuals and communicate your concerns to them. Large, unaccountable, abstract institutions, which again, libertarians and anarchists object to, are very difficult to reach and very difficult to convince that they're actually imposing costs on you that you didn't consent to. And even if they did care, even if they did know, they may not care because they don't have to. Whereas the blacksmith, the local government of a medieval village or an ancient Greek polis does. And so again, the distinction that I want to make between the use of tools in antiquity and the use of the system now is an analogous distinction between the anarchist libertarian distinction between local government and like the polis or medieval hamlet and the modern day nation state.
I would agree that given our current way of operating with technological bureaucratic organizations, that it is much less personal. However, in principle, it need not be, although given the fact that it impacts so many more people, then you might have a practical consideration that you might have a more practical consideration that they are sort of imposing something. Although, to be fair, though, the question then arises, though, with the large corporations, is it really the CEO who is actually imposing the costs on you, or is it actually someone lower down? And then the question is, whether you could, in principle, just kind of discuss or air your concerns. So even though it's on a larger scale level, I mean, the question is to what extent even can the CEO actually exert that kind of control. So I can see why you might want to treat. I don't want to say that our current situation is identical in every relevant respect. My primary point is that any system of technology is going to have costs and benefits, and I don't see, even though whilst there may be specific costs, I don't see why that entails or requires us to have a highly skeptical approach to any new technology. I mean, so for instance, the improvements in I don't intend to deviate down the nuclear weapons route, but insofar as nuclear weapons are available to small states, they're less likely to be invaded by large ones. And so technological advancement of something which is clearly an industrial technology, you could argue, has actually preserved small states. I mean, so if Libya had kept them, now obviously Libya isn't small, or wasn't.
Or Ukraine.
Exactly, Ukraine. Then they're going to be significantly less likely to be invaded. So I don't think it necessarily the case that any of the technology we currently have is by necessity centralizing in that way. On a slightly different point, you said Elul says that the whole system is about maximizing efficiency. What does he mean by that? Because efficiency only refers to a particular goal that you achieve.
Yeah, so the efficiency,
what's the goal?
Yeah, the efficiency referred to here is production. So there's two things.
Sorry. What do you mean by production? Because if you just mean literally maximization of output, that's clearly false. Or do you mean
let's look at a factory, right? A factory is, if you don't constantly upgrade a factory to be as efficient as possible at producing goods, that factory runs the risk of being outcompeted by some other factory that doesn't do so, right? And so there's a built-in incentive for all the factories to be, or all the factories owned by various companies that are competing with each other, to attempt to be as efficient as possible at modes of production. But efficiency also in this context means interfacing with each other. So he makes a big deal about, in the Middle Ages, you had guilds, you had these intermediate institutions that prevented the free flow of information with things like trade secrets and oaths and all sorts of things, whereas technique wants to have all this information at its fingertips whenever it wants. And so it seeks to erode all of these intermediate institutions that choke up the supply of information. Now, that doesn't mean there still aren't trade secrets amongst mega corporations today. But the thing is, though, there's different interests. There's the interest of the person, and they want to keep secrets to make a profit. That's always going to be there. But the system that they inhabit does not want that to happen, which is in part why so many of these intermediate groups were wiped out.
I still, maybe I'm being slow. I still don't exactly understand Lul's position as you've outlined it. I mean, all it seems to be to say is that firms intend to essentially profit maximize, and seems to throw in there some sort of notion that firms basically compete on price, or at least to a large extent, which is true as far as it goes, but isn't necessarily true. I mean, clearly there are many manufacturers who do not have a clearly efficient. I mean, so for instance, if you look at relatively small firms, they have far less capital equipment and they actually have higher average costs. Now, Kevin Carson would argue actually that they would have lower costs if it wasn't for the transport infrastructure, etc. But let's just leave that aside. But they have higher average costs, but they can still exist and they can still be profitable because they just differentiate their product. So I would say the goal is determined by the owners, and then really the question is about the ownership structure and who wants it and what's legitimate ownership and how did they arrive at that and various other legal things. But the whole point here is, though, I think, is that my position would be to say that the current situation whereby you could argue that the corporation tries to reduce the number of mediating institutions, and so you could argue maybe that what they want to do is, I mean, this is a classic argument, which I think is true to some extent, is that they want to treat everybody as fungible and treat sort of men and women as sort of economic units and put them in and make them continue to operate the corporation. And so effectively what you have is the state, the corporation, and the individual. My point, and I think my point is a narrow point, is that I fail to see why technology as such would lead to this outcome. I agree that to a large extent is the outcome that has appeared at present, but I fail to see why it necessarily follows, because I could imagine a situation in which you have for instance, like decentralized energy production, which could run computers and various. I mean, let's take back to nuclear, but let's take it on the civilian applications. You know, insofar as microreactors go off the ground, you could end up being sort of energy self-sufficient because a microreactor would have more than enough electricity than you would ever require. And you know, at least since that's been built, you are effectively independent in that way, and you can run the thought experiments that way. And so, and in that sense, you know, it would be more in the control and the purview of the individual. And I'd actually also argue as well is, insofar as the internet has come into existence, the amount of control that the individual has, in a sense, is now a lot higher than it was, say, in the 19th century, when if you're in a factory town, you could basically work for the factory owner, and even in the 70s and the 80s, where you'd have to commute very far and probably work for a corporation. But now you can run your own business from your own home. So I fail to see why technology necessarily implies a massive centralizing tendency.
Right. So let's go back to the distinction I already made, which is that organon and systems are analogous to medieval social order versus the modern day state. So let's look at tools in this social order. Let's start by defining what we have today. So what we have today is the ever increasing need to improve energy extraction. So there's this idea that there's a thought that if we improve energy efficiency, we can then lower consumption. But what ends up happening is the system just consumes up to the new energy threshold. And that's called Jevons paradox. And that paradox creates a ratchet effect where the system seeks to grow and grow and grow and grow in a cancerous fashion in order, in part, to meet its own demands of self-preservation with regards of maintaining the own energy resource requirement that it needs to operate in the first place, as well as repairing the infrastructure and capital stock. Whereas in a medieval village, there's no such ratchet effect. The blacksmith, the bower, the farrier, they don't have that ratchet effect. They can consume energy at the level at which the carrying capacity of the environment and their area allows, without this built-in ratchet effect to continually grow and grow and grow and grow. Unless, of course, they're equipping an army for a state, but that's a different question altogether.
Okay, can you just clarify what is making the the system sort of preserve its. I don't entirely follow why there's this the argument the system preserves itself, and that's why it needs to get even more energy. I mean, my position here would just be the case that, well, as energy becomes cheaper, people decide they can use more of it, and then they figure out there's more uses of it, and so then we want to produce even more energy. I mean, that would seem to be the obvious interpretation.
Well, that's part of it, but even so, let's say you're at the cutting edge of some sort of technological development, which is very energy hungry. Energy costs at that cutting edge of innovation and development need to be brought down, because if that's going to then be brought throughout all of society in a way that's socially useful for whoever wants to use it, let's say for commercial purposes, you could have a smartphone like in Wall Street, but like the movie Wall Street, but only for like CEOs and not for the average person. You need to lower the energy cost not only of production, but also the energy costs of daily use. And so you have a built-in drive to do that. And then, of course, once you have that level of efficient communication, that then opens up new possibilities for new developments, which again are initially energy hungry. But then for obvious reasons, you need to lower that. And it's this ratchet effect where you don't really have that ratchet effect with earlier uses of tools.
Well, okay, fair enough. I fail to see anything wrong with the ratchet effect. I mean, I think we should strive for the most abundant, reliable, and cheap energy that we can use, because it allows us to manipulate the environment to suit our goals. I mean, I fail to see in principle, why that would be a problem at all. I think it's laudable.
Right. So there's two ways we can go with this. We can talk about energy limits as such, but I've talked about that elsewhere. So I think the more relevant question is, given society as it develops in a technological system, I think the other objection, and this is one that is more, it's generally anybody would be concerned about this, but I think a libertarian audience would be especially concerned with this because of their idea of praxeology, which they get from Mises and popularized by Rothbard, which is a rational decision-making process. So we have two concomitant realities to this ratchet effect, what Toffler calls future shock and Rod Dreher calls liquid modernity. So let's say that we'll call it the meta. The meta is a game. So let's say we have chess, and then the meta for chess doesn't really change. The rules are always the same. People might find new ways to use those rules, but you're not changing from another game to another game to another game to another game. It's still chess. So let's say you want to make decisions in time t in chess. Well, you can, and you can then plan it out to play a game, because since the rules are the same and don't change, you can reasonably expect that if you plan 10 moves ahead, you will be able to rationally arrive at the goal that you want. But as we have increasing advances in energy consumption, which leads to increasing changes in society based on digital technology, transportation, and all sorts of other things, the meta changes at an increasingly rapid pace. Now, we can argue that there are going to be thermodynamic limits, but what Toffler pointed out was he assumed it would just keep the rate of change would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you're just in this like instant flux, a kind of Heraclitean flux of just no stability ever. Now, that's only a theoretical goal. I think there's probably thermodynamic reasons why that can't happen. But if you go from meta to meta to meta to meta, where everything is changing increasingly rapidly, it becomes practically impossible to make long-term rational calculations, because there's two things. One, you have no reason to assume that the meta, the game that you're playing, is the same game you're going to be playing 5 years from now. But furthermore, nobody could possibly know what the game would look like 5 years from now, because the costs of new technology being imposed are almost always only understood after the fact, because by the very nature of them being so abstract and new. And as this approaches absolute flux, which Toffler predicted, it makes rational decision-making over any length of time nearly impossible.
Can you give me some examples of things which historically were essential constants, or at least maybe not constants, but existent for a long time, which are currently changing at a rapid rate, and why it would be preferable, all things considered, why the benefits of maintaining that constant, or at least slower technological change, would outweigh the costs?
Well, let's look at something that I think both you and I would agree with, and a lot of right libertarians would agree with. Let's look at Hoppe, right? So Hoppe in Democracy, the God That Fails, talks about the importance of the family as the source of property with covenants, and many right libertarians agree with that. In fact, even plebline libertarians like Block agree with that. They just think that they won't be as overtly right wing. Okay, now if you want to be like, I say, if you look at boomers, Xers, millennials, and Gen Z, fewer and fewer of them are getting married and starting families, which from a Hoppian right libertarian perspective is bad. Part of that is the fact that the role that men and women play in society have changed so rapidly, even from the point of view of the boomers who got married sometime probably in the 60s or 70s or maybe even 80s, that people still haven't caught up to the meta to give helpful advice to men and women to start families, such that, you know, millennials and presumably Gen Z, which is still sociologically undefined yet as far as marriage rates, is just falling off a cliff. Now, there's two problems for that. One, if you care about family and organized social order in a propertarian society, that's bad. But also, even if you're not a right-leaning libertarian and maybe are left-wing or centrist, we need people to do the work that if you don't have, you have a population collapse. And a population collapse means that you're not going to have people to work the machines and do the kinds of things that you need, so that the way of life that you were accustomed to will radically change in the direction of poverty.
I would agree the social changes of the 19th century industrialization and early 20th were very badly dealt with, particularly by the church and other institutions. However, I do think that, well, at least since I've been aware of stuff from maybe the early 2000s, I think advice and how to sort of maintain strong family relations in a technological society are there. Whether they're practiced or not is another question. But I think really when it comes to family and the role of women in society, well, we'll say children, I think is the most, well, I think the main thing when it comes to family is hypermobility. And it was rarely emphasized of how, even if in your own interest, that it would actually be a good thing if you remained near your parents. Because when you had children, it would be significantly easier if you did. So I live in the city where my wife's parents are, and it's significantly better. And a friend of mine, he lives in the same sort of town or village that both sets of his wife's parents and his parents live, and they have lots of cousins around there as well, which is a significantly healthy way of doing things. I think possibly from the context of having relatively high levels of material poverty in a more general sense is probably one of the reasons why people decide to take the hypermobility and go. Although I would say, though, at least in England, for instance, though England has been mobile for a long time, not nearly to the same extent as it is now. Let's say from the 15th, 16th century, some of my sort of ancestors will have moved into Yorkshire away from Lancashire to move for work and to earn more money. So it's not something that hasn't happened historically. Well, nowhere near on the scale. So I think to a large extent, that is something that is dealable with in a technological society. Now, you could argue, though, insofar as our current economic system is dependent on female participation in the labor force. I mean, in particular, low-level retail jobs are predominantly women. And I've joked to my students, if you ever wanted to pick up a 40-year-old woman, go to a shop because they're all 40 or 50, and you have your pick if you wanted to. Insofar as if they'll leave the labor force, they'll end up being home-based workers of some description with kids, or maybe some sort of helping a husband do something or other. They'll leave the labor force. And to be fair, to some extent, you could say that's happened with the, what do they call it? The Great Resignation, I think, with people leaving low-level retail jobs. But I mean, the obvious solution for that to keep material things up is more automation, and thereby more energy production. And then you could have both. I don't see why you couldn't.
Well, the point is that we've already crossed the population threshold. We're already going to have a massive shrinkage of the economy due to lack of people that weren't born, which means everybody gets poorer. And that was directly the result of poorly handling these technological changes. Now, one of the reasons why they were poorly handled was because of the rapid state of change. Now, you could say there were benevolent forces as well within governments. Fine, sure. But even if we assume that they were not, or that the quote, our guys were in charge, let me ask this question without any reference to technology at all. Let's say that you want to make a praxeological decision. So you start out at the Peterson's 5-year plan, right? You're gonna use praxeology to do Jordan Peterson's 5-year plan. But let's say that society changes so rapidly from each meta of decision making process to where it approaches infinite flux, which is what Toffler talks about. Wouldn't you agree that it becomes practically impossible to make long-term decisions in that scenario?
It would become more difficult, yes, but then in that case, what you need to do is to focus on your general skill, and so that you can adapt and eventually come to use Taleb's term anti-fragile. So what you want to do is to focus on your learning, your adaptability, keeping it alert to provide things that consumers want, and always thinking about, okay, what is it that the consumer wants, and trying to orientate yourself around that. So yeah, of course. I mean, yes, it would be easier to plan long-term decisions insofar as society was more stable. I mean, it would be so much easier, you could say, if you could always have your cubicle job for 40 years. True, it would be. Would it be better? Well, that's not necessarily the case.
Well, I'm not talking about better in the sense of material comfort or material consumption. I'm talking about, do you actually lose the ability to make rational choices? And I would argue you do concomitantly. For each iterative change in the speed of change from one meta to the next, as you approach the Heraclitean flux of liquid modernity, you then lose, because to make a long-term decision, you have to have certain constants. So this is something that I mentioned in the paper I sent you. If you have a mathematical problem and they're all variables, you can certainly solve it symbolically, but you can't actually solve it. You need constants to actually solve it, to make it useful for some sort of engineering project. So if everything becomes a variable and there's no constants, then you can't actually solve it in a practical sense.
I don't see how, in a practical society we have at the moment, that there are no practical solutions to technology. I mean, people navigate them all the time, and the typical advice I would give people to navigate the world would basically be the same advice as I was given 30 years ago. I mean, which line of specialization I might mention to go down might be different. But the way in which you are generally successful in life is typically the same. As I say, be able to work on your skills, find do your due diligence with whoever you end up marrying, which 90% of men do, 95% I think by females by the age of like 35 do, at least historically. And I'd also include common law marriage as there, even though that technically doesn't exist, it in practice does. And then general things, live near where you work. I would give the same advice. I mean, obviously how you specifically navigate it, but I just fail to see why, at least the current state of technology, that there's no intelligible way of navigating society. Is it more difficult? Maybe. But at the same token, it allows great more possibility than existed historically. One of the concerns I have with the anti-technology crowd, I mean, Ted Kaczynski is a good example of this. Ted Kaczynski wants humans to be free and to have power, etc. Based on his power principle. I don't remember the exact stages of that. but then he would arbitrarily cut off what humans can accomplish and achieve because, oh no, that's becoming too technological. And effectively, it's preventing humans doing what humans do, which is to manipulate the environment to their own ends. And I think to take a skeptical approach to technology as such really is limiting and is incompatible with man's sort of nature, really.
Well, let's go to your point. So over the last 40 years, okay, with the ever increasing rate of change, and whether that's slowed up or whether it's going to speed up or slow down as of 2020s, that's an open question. I think it's going to slow down for other reasons, but we'll leave that alone for now. What that does is it privileges a certain kind of person. And of course, you and I believe people aren't fungible. So not everybody is going to be as competent as this particular type of person who can surf the wave of liquid modernity. What does that do then? It creates a lot of people that either don't do it very well or don't do it at all and fail, which leads to the population collapse, which makes everybody poorer. That's already happened. That's not a speculation. That's already happened. And that was a direct result of the rate of change, which made it very difficult for people to figure out, well, hey, how do we navigate this? How do we start a family? We have new technologies being introduced that deal with contraception. We have new jobs that pay better than old ones that used to pay well. And that means we're all poorer now from that argument based on the fact that the rate of change was so great, among other reasons, that many people, for whatever reason, failed to keep up. So they didn't have children. So now we have this population collapse with the boomers when they pass on, and that's going to make everybody poor, and it's going to make the economy smaller.
Technical point on the economy, whilst I do think you're probably correct that material conditions will worsen to some extent, I don't think population collapse per se will make us poorer. What would matter is the average level of productivity. That's what would matter. And whilst it's true that having a bigger population may allow you to have greater levels of specialization and therefore higher productivity, if one can automate, then that's not necessarily going to take place. I think our differing approaches comes from is this. I would point out that a lot of those things that you referred to seem to be historical contingent facts, which are not necessarily related to technological change, nor necessarily are massively influenced by. I mean, so for instance, let's take the birth rate. I read an interesting article about how France reduced their birth rate significantly in, I think it was the 17th century, and they got down to a fertility rate of like average of 3 children per woman. And if you look at Britain at this point until the 19th century, it's like 5.6 or 5.7. But obviously, the infant mortality, I mean, in the 19th century, you probably ended up about 3 or 3.5 or something that reproduced on average. So it's clear that even in the absence of modern contraceptive technology, you could significantly reduce your birth rate relative to what would happen before. And that's even not in a situation of war or famine, for instance. That would seem to be the choice of the people who happened to live in France at the time. So the question really, I think, is not necessarily the existence of contraception. It's why do people use it and to what extent do they use it and why? That would seem to me to be the fact of that. And then, of course, when it comes to starting a family and housing and stuff, I mean, you talk about land acquisition, you talk about the banking sector, etc., etc. Now, and unless, of course, you want to make the argument that the technological system per se depends upon fractional reserve, central banking, etc., then I don't see why they're necessarily related. Now, even if it were the case, though, that they were sort of, as it were, materially related and you would never achieve it without it, I still don't see why we couldn't make any logical distinctions and say, well, technology per se does not lead to this conclusion. it was one other thing. And even if we were wanting to make an argument that on a practical basis we should approach technology, I don't see how we can, because the only way we're actually going to organize and have any counter or parallel societies is by using it. So even on a principle basis or on a practical basis, simply don't see any utility in opposing it.
Okay, so I do want to get to the chat soon, so let me just rephrase this objection in a different way. It seems clear to me that ceteris paribus, if you have, let's say you're playing chess, and then you're playing the next move ahead, but then it turns out you're playing Scrabble. And then it turns out the next iteration you're playing Risk. And then at the next iteration you're playing poker. If you're changing from game to game to game like that, one, and then two, at an increasingly rapid rate of change, it's ceteris paribus. You cannot plan moves in advance. Would you agree?
I think to the extent that you have experience with games in many different versions, you can figure out the commonalities between them and can create a strategy to navigate such a game. And so I do think intelligible action is possible. As I said, is it harder? Yeah, of course it is.
Well, how would it be possible if you go from chess and you're planning for your next move, but then all of a sudden, when you say you play by email game with your friend, all of a sudden it's Scrabble? Like, the move that you plan doesn't matter anymore. It's now Scrabble. And if you try to plan for the next Scrabble move, and the next time you load up your play by email, it's Risk. You literally can't plan for the next move.
Scrabble is different. Risk is different, but not in the same way. But I mean, because you could argue that Risk is an area control game in the same way that chess is. So yes, you could create situations whereby there are categorically distinct types of game. True. But I think there are a lot more commonalities between games than you're seeming to imply. And even so, I mean, let's think about how the technology came into existence. The technology came into existence because people decided that it should come into existence. And so to some extent that fulfilled one of their goals. And so for at least one person, it's intelligible. And as I said, you could have an entirely stratified and static society, and you could say, well, actually, because technology is so bad, what we should do is you go to the Hindu caste system. So have the Dalits at the bottom, have the Brahmins on top, everyone knows what they're doing, we can stay there. I mean, that's, you could say, is the other end of the situation. Now, depending which one is desirable, all things considered. And additionally, what measures would you need to put into place to prevent technological development taking place? I mean, as I say, that's one of my major objections to Ted Kaczynski.
So the point here is, though, we've both had this conversation before about the relevancy of IQ. Obviously, we both would argue that many on the race realist right go a little too far in how they weight it, but nonetheless, it's something that matters. So, for example, Jordan Peterson says that there's just certain jobs today that if you're below a certain IQ threshold, you can't do. And that just creates hard problems in an information intelligence economy. Now, what you're saying is you have to be an elite performer in an intelligence economy to do this. Right, but that's the problem. Most people can't be. And that's one of the things that Jordan Peterson has pointed out.
I simply don't see that. There are certainly people who historically below a certain level of IQ are basically too stupid to do anything. I don't see, at least in the current job market. Now, you could say that, well, we don't really have a job market, we should have independent traders and whatever, fine, but just current occupation to provide something to exchange for somebody else for money, which we could then use to buy something else. I don't see that there's necessarily higher IQ required today than there was historically. I mean, if you currently work in, say, like a low-level retail job, I mean, the cognitive requirements to do that are not particularly high. And I would say that those people who can't function even at that level, I mean, I wouldn't really say that the IQ difference, I don't think there's necessarily the lowest threshold required to have to be gainfully employed is particularly changed. Although I would say there could well be more people who don't reach that IQ threshold, but that's because of low birth rates amongst high IQ people, and you don't get the genetic uplift that you got, say, in the as Gregory Clark, as Farewell to Arms has argued, from sort of those who are richer and more intelligent have more children or whatever, which then led to a general increase in IQ. And then, of course, in general, the social norms regarding marriage means that basically the idiot Chad can have loads of kids with a woman because it doesn't matter, because the welfare state will pick up all the bills for his kids. Whereas historically, you know, anybody sane would have kept any woman away from him. And so even on sociological levels, you have those sort of, broadly speaking, eugenic practices simply don't exist. So I would argue that's the predominant problem, not that the IQ to hold down a particular position has actually gone up significantly. It's just there's more people who are lower in IQ.
All right. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to get to some of the chats, especially the supers. We have hello for 99 cents. Super sticker. Thank you. Hello. Ori Samsonov for 16 shekels. These products are the best things that come out of technology. Well, I mean, I'm sure Swithun would agree that the state provided a valuable service when DARPA created the internet. Nerve AM VMaker, 10 US dollars. If advanced technology allows one group to dominate another, then how could its progress be limited? If one group limits technology, wouldn't it just be conquered by the group that didn't limit tech? Okay, so there's a couple things here. One is, you could say, let's use a different example, like the empire, the Roman Empire. Let's say that you didn't adopt the principles of statecraft of the Roman Empire. Would you just get conquered? In many cases, yes. In many cases, you would just get conquered, but not in all cases. And eventually, there were internal contradictions within the Roman political system that allowed for other states and nations to rise and replace them. And that took hundreds of years. And in the case of the Eastern Roman Empire, it took 1,000 years. So, in just like the Roman imperial system, there are contradictions within technology, which over time will manifest. I discussed Ted Kaczynski yesterday. I think one of them is going to be the production of the people that got left behind that become antisocial and difficult or impossible for the system to deal with, which is going to be a source of friction, which he hypothesized would lead to a crisis point, which in his mind, his revolutionary forces would attempt to destroy the machine. Second of all, so in one sense, that's a problem for any idea whose time has come. If Genghis Khan rides up, you better just surrender. If the Roman legions march up, you better just surrender. Or find some workaround. Now, then the other question is, how do you eliminate technology? How would you eliminate technology? Well, this is something actually that I think libertarians already sort of know. Oftentimes when people object and say, well, Mr. Libertarian, how are we going to get rid of the state? Many libertarians will say, look, we're going to have this, we're going to have a point in time, hopefully, through education, through the improved benefits of seeing the libertarian society implemented, that there's going to be a social mental change in people's actions where they view the state as illegitimate as slavery. So, for example, you can look at Rene Girard, and he said that, with the advent of Christ and the sacrifice on the cross, the idea of sacrifice in religion has gone away. You don't have pagans, slaughtering goats and pigs anymore. And the libertarian would say, yeah, also we have slavery being outlawed. It's no longer acceptable. And so they'll say, well, our goal is at some point in the future, we want the state to be seen as just unacceptable based on some sort of moral awakening. And I would argue, well, okay, that's what I would argue for as well. One possible way. There's others, but let's just limit it to that. And I think the libertarian would have to say that's at least plausibly the case, because if they want to argue it's plausibly the case that such a moral awakening could lead to the abolition of the state, in the same way that we've abolished slavery and moved beyond animal sacrifices and human sacrifices, this would have to be at least plausibly optional. So I guess this question would also be for you too, as a super chat.
Yeah, so I'd agree broadly with Todd's first point with respect to the Romans and stuff. If you do become technologically limited, then you could be. But I mean, again, if you provide a particularly useful service in certain respects and are technologically not that strong, then yeah, you might not be invaded. I mean, you do get some pacifist communities, and there's no reason in principle.
Well, think of the Amish, right? They're a perfect example.
Yeah. Although you could argue to some extent that the Amish free ride on the US military, to some extent, you could make that claim. But in principle, no, I'm not saying that's necessarily true. But there are ways in which less technologically advanced societies can provide value to people. I think I tried to make that point before. I mean, with specific services and whatever, they can provide some benefits. And similarly, if one area had a high level of technology, then it could conquer somebody else. That's true. And I think even with sort of like, although I think the difference of the state is I could plausibly conceive of the situation we have various anarchist communities around the world. And I think, though, that with technology, people will try to adopt it. And I think to some extent, you could argue some of the Amish communities are becoming more technological than they were. I think they had electric bikes, I think was one article I read recently. Now, you could always say, well, historically, that's what they've always done anyway. They've appropriated some forms of technology. But I think technology is contagious in a way that statism isn't, in a certain sense, because I do think it does tap into the human goal to sort of manipulate the environment to suit your own goals. And so I think it'd be more difficult than that. But I don't see in principle why it couldn't.
Okay, so two things. One, I want to also respond to that super chat in another way, and then two, I think there's another, not a super chat, but another chat that I want to respond to. The way that a non-technological society can coexist and survive with a technological society, if we view a technological society like Genghis Khan of the Romans, where a direct confrontation is unfeasible, is you provide something that can only be produced in a low-tech environment that is perennially useful, that the technological society itself can't produce. One example might be children, actual children, because the technological society has a really hard time doing that. Now, that's just one possibility to coexist. So the goal is to provide something in this lower energy consumption level that isn't easily produced at a higher level energy consumption level. This is, I think, Paul Moosefoot. This is for you, Swithun. Maybe more for Swithun. He sounds like a winner of the tech revolution. Many of us lost. I don't see how you can look at the teenage girl's suicide and say that's fine.
Depends how much money you make from ads on it. That was a joke. When it's how best to respond to this? Yes, there are certainly problems with it, but I would say that they just magnify the problems that already exist rather than are causative of most of the problems. I mean, the girl who commits suicide is probably, as I mentioned in the AI roundtable, he's probably from a situation from a not particularly great background, and spends most of her life on there, has no friends, etc., etc. Now, I agree that you could argue that it is more difficult to make friends now than it was historically, because you don't see it, and people have sort of the same sort of social situations. And so I do think there is a lot of things that could be done that aren't done that could aid this. I mean, so for instance, I thought that, for instance, churches should try and effectively put on singles events and provide an environment in which you just meet people, because just meeting people these days is not straightforward in the way that it would have been historically. So I definitely think there are challenges to the technological side. I just think that to a large extent surmountable, and that we can't be blinded to the fact that technology has overall benefits. And just to respond to one of the super chats in a similar vein to that, as Marv Alice says, people are smart, we're fine, so what's the issue? I mean, I would argue really that the reason why the less cognitively able people are kept behind, and you might expect what my answer is going to be here, is to a large extent the regulatory state, licensing, etc., preventing people from doing small scale self-employment, etc., so that you can't really compete in any way because the barriers to entry are high. I mean, just take the things like health and safety. I mean, you can't sell anything outside of your own kitchen because, oh no, it doesn't conform to standards, it could kill people. It's like, I don't remember anyone dying in my kitchen before. I think your ire. I think the problems with the basically more stupid people primarily doesn't come from technology; it comes from the state.
Okay, final thoughts. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Swithin.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Oh, the
And
Industrial Revolution has been, and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. That's from Ted.
um,
No, I want your final thought. That was mine. Just give
oh,
me.
right. Sorry. My final thought is: I think yes, technology creates a lot of problems that historically didn't exist, but I do think it creates massive benefits that previously didn't exist. You can go around and see. We can read books that's online that you know you would have had to travel thousands of miles to go and read, and can engage with the best minds of the world has ever produced. We can have this discussion now we historically couldn't. We can create food and we can eat in a very, very short time period, and even eat good food. I'm not just meaning like microwavable things, because we have oven control technology and heat. And it gives us some great benefits. As I say, it brings some challenges, and I don't think those challenges have been fully dealt with yet. But I'm optimistic that they can be. And whilst there will still be costs, as there are to any social and economic system, that ultimately the technological society will be the best society.
All right. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fire podcast, signing off.